Dr. Pawan Sinha is a professor of vision and computational science at MIT. About 10 or so years ago, he published his findings that were based on a study of some 200 children in the country of India who were once blind but were given a surgery to restore their sight. By studying them, Dr. Sinha attempted to answer an age-old question that goes like this. Since a person who is blind learns things in darkness his or her whole life up to that point, such as feeling the difference in objects between, say, a ball and a cube, and difference between wood and a cloth and that kind of thing, how does that knowledge translate once they're able to actually see? Well, first of all, we need to realize, and this may sound funny, but it is serious, we don't actually see with our eyes. I don't mean we see with our feet or our hands. Our eyes are simply tools that our brain uses to see the outside world. The seeing is actually done in the back of your brain. The rear lobe has the functions for seeing. It's sort of like a window. Okay, the window itself doesn't see at all. It simply sits there. But it is an opening or a passageway to the outside for whoever's inside to see what's out there. Therefore, you can theoretically have the world's most perfect eyes and still be blind if your brain is damaged in some manner, especially if you were hit in the back of the head. That's common to happen. Some kind of trauma in an accident will make you not be able to see. Now back to the doctor. He observed that formerly blind children had great difficulty initially getting accustomed to seeing things. Basically, their brain has to learn how to see, ever since it's never done that before. There's so many processes that take place inside our bodies just in order to see that it's really staggering when you think of what the body has to do just to see and make sense of an image. Our bodies are so used to this because we've done it all of our lives and our brains are trained in that manner. But so we don't even think of it really, we just open our eyes and we see. But among some of the issues that they have observed with people seeing for the first time is that some have difficulty with depth perception. If someone walks away, they are thinking this person's literally shrinking in size, and they're really not. Other people experience swirling colors because there's so much stimuli that the eye is bringing in and the brain has to make sense of. The good news is that in time, most of these individuals' sight normalizes as the brain gets used to what it's seeing, and things go a lot better the rest of their lives. All this seeing and blindness talk leads to one of the miracles performed by Jesus, where he heals a blind man, which is what we'll look at today. Over the last month or 5 or 6 weeks, we've been driving home this point that Jesus keeps telling his disciples in so many words that they are spiritually blind. And now we sort of get to the climax, and he actually literally heals a blind man. In a spiritual sense, the disciples need done to them what this blind man had literally done to them, be healed of their blindness. And so it's what we'll look at in Mark chapter 8 this morning. It's a rather short passage from verses 22 to 26. The words are on the screen as always, and we'll read Mark chapter 8 starting in verse 22. Then he came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands on him, he asked if he saw anything. And he looked up and said, I see men like trees walking. Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up. And he was restored and saw everyone clearly. Then he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town nor tell anyone in the town. The Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of His holy word. This morning we're going to look at this from basically two perspectives. One, at first of all, the purpose of miracles, and look at the miracle a little more in depth. And then we'll look at the concept of spiritual blindness, which we see through the literal blindness that Jesus heals in the passage. Well, first things first, what is the purpose of miracles? I don't know if you ever ask yourself that question. We read about miracles in the Bible. It's not for God to wow us with how great He is, with all of His abilities. He's not like a little kid with a new toy bragging, hey, look what I can do now. Nothing like that. The purpose of miracles is to confirm one's revelation from God. I think it's easier to understand the concept by looking at the miracles we encounter in the Bible. For instance, with some exceptions, miracles in the Bible tend to come in clusters. When you read from the very beginning, from Genesis on, we eventually get to Moses, and we see a lot of miracles surrounding Moses because he's the initiator of God's covenant to man. So many miracles were performed around him to confirm to the people Moses' position as mediator between God and man. It's sort of like saying, okay, Moses can tell the people, God used me to do this, this, and this, so now you can trust that the things I'm telling you are also from God. Then we see miracles cluster around the prophets of Elijah and Elisha, because they were the first representatives to man of what we call the prophetic office, or being a prophet, delivering a message from God. Same as Moses, because they proved to the people they were carrying God's word through these miracles that they performed, and people would have reason then to believe the prophetic words that they were preaching after that. Then we see that most of the miracles by far occur in the New Testament around some guy named Jesus. You might have heard of him along the way. Jesus, interestingly, is the fulfillment of the Old Covenant that Moses initiated, and that Elijah and Elisha and the prophets after had spoken of. So you get an awful lot of miracles surrounding Jesus. And lastly, I should mention, I didn't put it on the slide, but in the book of Acts we have a few more miracles that are performed by the apostles, who are just the extension of Jesus, but it still bears mentioning. So this is the purpose of God's miracles, to confirm one's revelation from God. Now, when we look at Mark chapter 8, we need to go to verse 11 of that chapter and read how the Pharisees were asking Jesus for a sign. A sign is another word for a miracle. They wanted Jesus to prove to him through a miracle that he was who he said he was. But we see Jesus refused that request. Why do you suppose he declines this request from the Pharisees, but then, shortly after, goes and performs a miracle for other people before this same chapter is over? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. Along with confirming one's revelation from God, Jesus also performs miracles not to indulge the whims of non-believers, but to address a genuine need. Earlier in the chapter, when the Pharisees asked for the sign or the miracle, what do you suppose they were trying to get out of this? What do you think they wanted Jesus to do? What miracle do you think would be miraculous enough to prove to these Pharisees that Jesus was not just any mere man? I mean, he had just fed 5,000 men plus their families with a few loaves and fish. Then he repeats virtually the same miracle shortly after that. So wouldn't that be good enough? Well, maybe what would they want? Maybe he could take a pig, give it wings, and make it fly. That way, when they said, I'll believe Jesus when pigs fly, he could make a pig fly. Okay, something like that. But you know what? As I was thinking through this sort of comical example, it occurred to me that a pig is an unclean animal, so they probably wouldn't even like that, probably, the way that they thought. They'd have nothing to do with that. The fact is, I think the Pharisees were going to find something wrong with everything that Jesus did. So he wasn't even going to indulge them. They were so far from God in their thinking. They had corrupted their religion, and they really made their religion the epitome of self-righteousness and self-centeredness. Furthermore, Jesus, you may remember on another occasion, calls them a brood of vipers. Okay, that's a pretty strong language. That's why Jesus didn't indulge them with a miracle on this occasion. He basically wasn't going to waste a miracle on someone who's not even going to believe anyway. The Pharisees knew the specifics of the Jewish faith more than most people, and they knew what the Scripture said about the Messiah, but the fact is they flat out rejected him. So performing this one miracle isn't going to change their minds at all. But later on, Jesus encounters a man with a legitimate physical need, a man who is blind. So Jesus uses this man as an example to illustrate a very important point about faith, which is faith versus spiritual blindness. If you're like me and you're reading through this passage, first thing you notice is that this miracle, something's not quite right about it. Okay? Why wasn't the man healed with Jesus' first touch? Well, there's a few suggestions to this. First, you could say, well, maybe Jesus just wasn't spiritually strong enough to heal the man the first time. Well, we'll kick that out, reject that, because it doesn't jive with all that we know about Jesus. Other miracles he did, he accomplished them all the first time. Okay, so it's not like this is Jesus' normal operating procedure to do things in steps. So there has to be a reason for it. Well, if Jesus could have healed the man in one step but didn't, why didn't he? Why did he choose not to do it all at once? Well, it goes back to this issue we keep talking about spiritual blindness. Remember that at this point in the story, Jesus is teaching his disciples through these events that have occurred. He's using them as teachable moments. That way they understand. Jesus at one point even sits them down, reviews what happens, and asks them, don't you understand? The disciples at this point, they're still wrestling with this spiritual blindness. They're slowly understanding, but they're not where they should be. So, their truth about God is cloudy and foggy, really, at best. They see through or understand through a very clouded lens at this point. So Jesus keeps working on them. That's exactly what's going on with the blind man here. He was brought to Jesus in Mark 8. Jesus touches him once, makes a little bit of progress, but it takes a further touch to complete the work he started. It's not because Jesus couldn't heal him in one step. It's because he wanted to illustrate a very important point through this teachable moment. In the beginning, I said how several different things can affect a person to make them blind. It could be the result of brain damage. There's nothing wrong with the eye itself, but if your brain is damaged, you may not be able to see. Or maybe it could be because your eyeball is irregularly shaped, like mine, honestly. I have what you call astigmatism, which means your eyeball is a little more oblong than perfectly round. Or maybe there could actually be a defect in the lens in your eye. Back in the days of Jesus, this was the most common cause of blindness because the climate of the area is very dry. And you have these strong winds that whip up sandstorms quite frequently. When sand gets into your eye, if it's not flushed out, it can get infected in there, and it can cause your eye lens to degenerate. And people can become blind because of it. With modern procedures, doctors can remove that infected or clouded lens and replace it with a new clean one, restoring sight. But back then, of course, they couldn't do that. So you were pretty much out of luck unless you happened across a carpenter from Nazareth who was in the business of healing people. The passage is proof that Jesus can heal people in a variety of ways, but it's a lot more than that even. We can relate the disciples' spirituality to a situation where their lens is clouded, but their brain is working completely fine, so it's an issue with the eye. I say this because the disciples are intelligent men. Okay, there's nothing wrong with their brains, but they're somehow still blinded to this truth. And that's how it is. When people are spiritually blinded, it takes the power and grace of God, first and foremost, to remove that clouded lens and to replace it with a brand new clear lens that opens up their world to a variety of possibilities that they could never see before. And I hope that you all here understand that once you are given this new sight, you never want to go back to the way it was before. Why would you ever give up that brand new sight? In the same way, this is how we see Jesus interact with the blind man. He's healing spiritual blindness, and that also comes in steps. No one ever comes to Jesus seeing perfectly. It's a process that really lasts a lifetime. Look at this man in Mark 8. Jesus touches him. He asks if he sees anything, and then he says he sees something like trees that are walking around. Well, relate this to salvation, and we do it this way. At this point, the man has some sight. He's not completely in the dark anymore. So that's sort of like, at this point, a person has saving faith. He has some type of sight, albeit not real good sight. And I think we can look at the thief on the cross when Jesus was being crucified, who professed faith in Jesus. And remember when he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. This thief on the cross did not do a single positive thing for the kingdom of God, because he was going to die very soon, probably within minutes. And I'm sure his understanding of the Christian faith was clouded at best, and that's probably being generous. Yet, in that state, Jesus still promised him a place in heaven. Now, we can look at this, but we can't say, okay, well, that's my ticket. I can be like this thief. I just, skate in, and at the very end, and I'm good to go. That's not how we look at the thief on the cross, how he got into heaven at the last minute. Imagine what a miserable life this thief must have led up to that point. He had no kind of assurance whatsoever of his eternity. He spent his life stealing from people, doing whatever else. We don't even want to imagine what kind of a life he led. It's a terrible way to live your life. We should seek after Jesus for this additional, or this second touch, to make our vision as clear as it can be. And in the same way, it's the way that we don't want to live our lives with clouded vision either. We don't want to have this clouded understanding of the things of God. In Mark 8, the second touch from Jesus does the trick, as this man can see clearly from then on. And we should all be individually praying for a second touch from Jesus, even a third touch, fourth touch, fifth touch, whatever it takes for the rest of our lives. And as I was researching and delving into this passage, I wondered what connection there is from this miracle to the 4th of July. Okay, we're celebrating that in a few days here. Well, just look at the words near the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, which was signed on July 4th of 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words strongly suggest an understanding of godly principles. But here in the 21st century, are Christians afforded the guarantee of life and of liberty and of the pursuit of happiness? Christians are being persecuted more and more as every year goes on. our self-proclaimed nation under God. As a nation, I do think it's pretty clear we would all agree that we are going in the wrong direction, and we've been doing so for some time now. But also, if you haven't noticed, you turn on the news, the economy is booming right now. It seems like every week the stock market is setting a new record, and that's a good thing. History shows us that typically what happens is when the economy does well, what happens to morality? It goes down. It plummets. And the reverse is true. Typically when the economy tanks, the morality starts to increase. Are we asking God? We're now going to God. Other things aren't going well for us, so can you intervene for us? Well, I hope that we are not at the beginning of a morality plummet, because we've already nationally been dealing with what you might call some spiritual eye infection, glaucoma, whatever word you want to use to relate it to. My only problem with this analogy that I came up with is that when you are blind, you're pretty much a victim of your blindness, and I don't want to paint us as victims of spiritual blindness on a national level, because it seems like quite often we have been choosing spiritual blindness over spiritual sight. Like I said earlier, if you live in a dry climate among all these sandstorms, you have to keep your eyes clean, or you risk eventual blindness. In the same way, we need to keep ourselves morally clean, or else we risk spiritual blindness. Do you know that it is possible to also go blind if you spend too much time in the dark? In underdeveloped countries specifically, where they do a lot of mining, oftentimes they'll use mules to help with the work, to carry wagons of coal and that kind of thing. What they have to do there is they have to make the concerted effort to remember periodically to bring the mules to the surface, get them exposed to the sun, or else these mules will become blind sooner rather than later. That's sort of how I see the United States. We need to make that conscious effort to get exposure to the light of God, or else we do seriously run the risk of serious, permanent spiritual blindness. Also, back in 2001, a man named Eric Weihenmayer set a world record by becoming the first blind man to ever climb Mount Everest. By the end of the next year, he also completed what they call the 7 summits. And this is where you reach the peak of the tallest mountain on each of the 7 continents. It is an amazing feat for someone to be able to do this. And this blind man did that as well in 2002. But it reminds us of how much easier it would be to climb a mountain or to do anything when you can see versus not being able to see. We look around and we see all these other people walking around in spiritual blindness, and we just wonder to ourselves how much easier life could be for these people if they could only see. But good thing is, there is something that the church can do about it. We can at least let those who are spiritually blind know there is a cure. His name is Jesus Christ. We can't force them to go to Jesus, just like we can't force a person who's blind to go to a doctor and to get the surgery that they need to restore their vision. But at least the least we can do is inform them that there is a solution out there. After that, it's up to them. I'd like to encourage you, as you're celebrating the 4th of July this week, consider what you can do to help bring the nation back to God. It seems like a monumental task, and I'm not suggesting that one person can do it alone. But you got to start somewhere. Think of it like it's easy to take a wooden pencil and break it, but what happens if you have 6, 7, 8 or more pencils together? It's much harder, if not impossible, for the average person to break that many pencils that are bound together. There is great spiritual blindness, moral blindness in the world, But as we've seen today, there are cures for that type of blindness too. If maybe you're like me in that you can't help anyone who is literally blind. I mean, I'm not a doctor. I can't perform that surgery. I can try to perform the surgery on you and prove to you I'm not a doctor. Okay? You don't want that. But we do know for sure there is a cure for spiritual blindness, this moral type of blindness, and it's faith in Jesus Christ. Honestly, I do not think this nation has gone too far down the wrong path of darkness that leads to blindness. I do think there is time to turn back still if we want to. We can regain our sight, but getting back that sight happens one believer at a time and one church at a time. For us, we need to pray for multiple touches from Jesus, from the Lord, to keep us going. Keep asking God to analyze our lives honestly and see if there's anything displeasing in there that we can then change and get that darkness out of there and start living to the best of our ability for Him. We see how Jesus opened the eyes of the blind, and He still does that to this day. When He opens us, we can then see what a wonderful Savior that we serve. Let us now bow our heads and go to Him in prayer.